So that really reshaped my ideas of what their silence meant. That in some ways they were waiting for an audience to be okay with it, to be just sitting with that information and not try to do the next loud thing with it, but just to take that in. And also that their silence with their own kids was not necessarily just about their own traumas, but also thinking about what the effects they would have on their own kids.
This is Eric Carr, a volunteer interviewer with the Kizuna Project. It is March 28th, 2026, and I am in Tucson with Dr. Esaki. Do I have permission to record you?
Yes, you do.
And just some basic information for the opening. When and where were you born?
I was born in Redwood City, California in 1979.
Okay, the focus of this interview is on the incarceration of your family and how that affected your professional career, but mostly your professional career. So can we start with how you got into your field of expertise and what kind of formative experiences in your family led you to where you are today?
So I think I've always been in this field, and in that sense. So my first vivid memory, like a vivid personal memory, was actually at a funeral of my great-grandmother, and it was an open casket. So there's a lot of questions I have in retrospect, but so that experience of the actual ritual, meeting of the rest of the family, everything around that. So in many ways I've been kind of asking deeper questions about spirituality, belonging since I've been ever conscious. Funny random stuff. I was I think the youngest member of the Jungian Society of San Francisco. That was pretty funny in high school, and then also being kind of politically conscious. In third grade, I won the Martin Luther King speech essay competition, which was a pretty good speech now that I think about it, especially for like third graders. So I've been kind of in this field since I've been a young kid. But I've had a lot of other things. So I did another career path of in art, specifically music, and what was the other thing? So could have been a teacher. I had like some career paths. I was like teacher, artist. What's fortunate about this is I kind of get to do all of it. So.
Your mom was an activist in the San Francisco state demonstrations.
Yes.
Do you think that was influenced by her parents' experience as Japanese Americans during incarceration and internment, and also do you think that affected you growing up?
Right, that's a good way of putting it. It's sort of ripple effects. Her parents are not politically, active in that way. They were community active, so the community spaces, community centers were very important to her parents. But it was more the reaction, as in she couldn't get her parents to say anything about their experience, and that kind of frustration and thought process. In the 60s, a lot of folks were part of those radical political movements, at least in consciousness sense. So I think that all kind of came together for her in the 60s for the San Francisco State uprisings.
With what you just said about her not being able to get answers from her parents, that's a major theme of your work, is this idea of non-binary silence. Can you talk about what that means and also how that experience fits into this paradigm of non-binary silences?
So I've been looking at silences for a long time. Clearly, you pointed to some early experiences where I'd have things with kind of interested in different types of silences of spirituality, silences within art. But this other kind of dimension came, especially to my consciousness, when there was a few instances where I'd be talking to my grandparents, and these are the people all my grandparents were interned in the camps, and they would tell me their stories about what happened. And when I would be talking to them initially, I'd often think, oh, this is stuff that everyone's heard, so it's just coming to me now. But when I would be like on drive homes, my parents would just be floored and shocked because they had never heard those stories before. And in fact, they weren't even in the rooms with me. They were kind of off the side, kind of listening. But so I realized from those sorts of experiences that it wasn't that my grandparents were so scarred by their experiences that they wouldn't want to talk about it. That's how my mother's generation would talk about these things, that they had such a traumatic experience, which was true, that they had such a traumatic experience that they were not able to talk about them because it was just too painful. That's at least how they processed it. My parents' generation processed it. But from what I've learned is that it's not necessarily just about the experiences they had, but also their audience who is listening. And for what they explained to me, because I could gather, is they believed that I wouldn't be hurt by the information they were telling me. And they were just stories. I mean, they were obviously important stories to them, but they were just stories. Whereas they believed that my parents, from other conversations, they believed my parents' generation would hear these stories and just be mad or just want to do something with them, instead of just sitting there and hearing the stories. So that really reshaped my ideas of what their silence meant. That in some ways they were waiting for an audience to be okay with it, to be just sitting with that information and not try to do the next loud thing with it, but just to take that in. And also that their silence with their own kids was not necessarily just about their own traumas, but also thinking about what the effects they would have on their own kids. I have 2 young kids right now, and I would have trouble also being vulnerable and telling them the types of things that if I had gone through something like that. But in addition, you kind of worry about what kinds of pains are you passing on to your kids. In many ways, their generation, my grandparents' generation, thought that their kids were in a much better political situation than they grew up in, and were just, frankly, just happy enough that they were in that place, and not in the place they were just a decade ago. So, in short, I started to learn that silence was much more dynamic, had much more cultural dimensions, had a lot of those social silencing and political silencing and psychological traumas of silence are not necessarily just all one thing, but in fact are all kind of mixed up together. That's all to point out my theory of non-binary silence is an idea of how different silences come together. So it's not just this or that, or off and on, quiet or loud, but when you bring all these things together. So in that example I just gave, me and my grandparents' generation were in a place that we weren't in that kind of hurt place, and the silence we had together allowed them to tell their stories of their own traumas without me also being traumatized in the way that they feared.
You mentioned this in your book in the context of Japanese culture specifically, where silence is embedded into all of these different art practices. Mm-hmm. How do you think that informs this kind of more intersectional silence and the broader sense of the emotional kind, and that you had enough distance because of the silence to your parents' generation? How does all of that kind of come together to create what you're talking about?
Well, one thing you can kind of think of silence as a kind of cultural skill. In other words, you can use certain things to accomplish certain things. So if you're worried about hurting someone, you could not tell them about it, right? Or if you want to share something and be in a close emotional relationship, you can then share things. That's all part of the cultural silencing, or silences, as I would put. When you go to a different country and you go through an entirely different subset of political experiences, these start to not only become tools, but also blended into other ones that already exist. So Japanese people were not, foreign to being politically silenced. In fact, that was very much part of their existence at the Meiji era, is what that generation came from. Early Showa also. But they had a lot of governmental directed silencing. This is long legacies of religious silencing, cultural silencing, political silencing. So when they came to the States, this is one of the things I realized, is that they already had this toolkit, that they already had been hard schooled in whatever government political environments are happening. And they basically just use the same toolkit within this country. And then with new experiences and new ideas, all those kind of come together.
Would you say this idea of the silence is a keystone of your philosophy around understanding the different repercussions of what happened through generations, not just generations from the incarcerated people, but also, like you mentioned, going back to the Meiji area and even before with non-Bon era and things like that?
So one thing I realized when doing more research is that I actually didn't necessarily know all the language from my grandparents, but I did inherit a lot of silences. So they don't necessarily have to have a linguistic description to know what these things are, to know how you're supposed to inhabit them, how you're supposed to express them, and kind of the larger meaning of them. And which is a pretty profound understanding that silences in many ways are able to be passed down from generations without the full articulation of the larger cultural context. Now, I did lose things, of course, by not knowing all those things, but many of those things I did in fact learn. So these things are passed down. They're learned by how you behave around people. When you're doing an artistic context or religious context, you learn those because that's the timing of things, that's the expected experience to have. That's when you know when things are going well or not well. It's kind of hard to describe from people outside of cultures, but if you're within a culture, you kind of just know when things are going well, when a party is going well, when a ritual is going well, when your dinner is going well. There's not a lot of like bullet points you need to hit, but you go like, oh, this party feels good. You know, this family gathering feels good. Those things get passed down. And I learned in my young adulthood that I, in fact, had inherited a lot of those.
One of your areas of expertise is kind of cross-cultural similarities in these kinds of politically traumatic events.
Yes.
And injustices. Do you see that silence as being part of that as well? And also, what other kinds of commonalities do you see and share and empathize with?
So my master's degree work is in African American religions, specifically pre-Civil War African American religions. So they were dealing with a very intense political moment with the ending of slavery, or the political ending of slavery. A lot of what these scholars did, so we're speaking classically, a lot of what these scholars did was actually look to old African American art forms to kind of decode their spirituality, their theological perspectives, and their philosophies. And so they would take art, like gospels, like textiles, things like that, and they would figure out scholastic ways to decode these points that they're passing on. And they can find their heritage and remnants, their traces of their heritage that they have today through that process. So I essentially just steal a bunch of academic stuff from African American religious studies and apply them to Asian Americans, and we're talking about Japanese Americans specific. So a lot of the things that they would uncover in their context is specific to them. For Japanese Americans, I just continually developed and just saw more silences being coded, more different spaces, different methods, different ways. So I essentially taking this example from African Americans where they're in a political context in which they cannot express the fullness of their own culture for lots of different political, economic, social reasons, but they develop ways to encode a lot of their elements into their art forms. I just basically take that same kind of method and apply it to Japanese Americans, and there's just a lot of silences, and I was able to draw that from it.
Can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, one of the first ones I give is gardening. And one of the things that they do is a ritual before this is pruning specifically. And I don't know if they would call it a ritual, but it is. And that basically they are in the long-term care of a living thing. And now again, a lot of times we think of gardeners as just people like, trimming stuff and that kind of thing. From the traditional perspective of the Japanese gardener, or at least the inherited one for Japanese Americans, is that they're really in the lifelong, long-term care of a living thing. And so as they're pruning, they walk around it, and they're getting a sense of how it inhabits its space. They learn its health over time. They learn how things grow and their pacing of things to grow. And then when they make those decisions and actually do the cuts, what they're doing is opening up a space within the tree or the bush. And what that does is allow light to fall down to reach the lower branches, which then grow faster. Or you keep certain elements there to slow down growth in other places. And that allows certain places to grow faster, certain places to slow down, or eliminating areas to make the overall life and beauty of the tree healthy. So what is the silencing here? Silence is there. We have spatial silence, which is in other words, how the kind of inhabiting spaces, as well as the kind of respect you have to a living being that's in your care. You don't just go and hack it, but you think of its over decades lifetime. How am I going to guide this to its most beautiful, or in the orchard case, productive, but also healthy sense of its life. And in turn, some other silences that come up with is gardening. So that's a basic Japanese garden technique. With spatial silencing, we're thinking of branches, we're thinking of sunlight, we're thinking of airflow, location within an artistic garden. All that's kind of typical Japanese stuff. The Japanese American aspect I learned was that what they're doing is pruning trees for their clients. Right, so they're not just pruning trees. Well, they also have their own trees that and you can see Japanese gardens at Japanese American religious organizations all the time. But they are most often doing their pruning for a client, and clients usually don't say like, "Hey, Japanese person, just do what you want with my space." They go like, "I have a vision of what my space is going to look like and how I want my trees to appear." Now, what that means is they're trying to do all the things that they're for the health and beauty of things, but they're also trying to cater to the whims / often slightly racist or majorly racist desires of their clientele. And so over time, you can see the kind of political silencing and marginalization literally within layers and years of those trees. For gardeners, as they're looking at the thing in front of them, they're also not just seeing the life form, but also the legacies and decades of other gardeners who have cared for this same plant. And so they can see their political environment and their social environment, as well as sometimes the religious perspectives of how they're thinking of the beings under their care.
Going to that idea of the racism even being part of something like gardening or pruning a tree, that's another area of expertise that you have. So academically, with that kind of context in mind, you know a lot about the political climate leading up to the incarceration and detainment of Japanese people in these camps. Can you tell us about that atmosphere and the things that came together to create this? And then, if you don't mind, also how that's still extrapolating out to today.
Sure. I'll see if I can take it one at a time. So first of all, one of the big things that the U.S. government, strange thing today, but back then in the 1930s, the United States had very, very few people with Japanese knowledge. They knew about Japan, kind of politics and stuff, but actually knew Japanese culture and language. Outside of Japanese people, right? So there very much was a deep fear, not just of Japanese people, but Japanese language. A lot of the professional scholarship at the time taught that language is a hardwired thing. In other words, the language you grew up with shapes your brain and all your behaviors and how you think, what you're capable of thinking, and also, in turns, your political things that work for you politically and don't work for you politically. And one of the things that they had thought was that if you spoke languages affiliated with fascist groups or fascist nations or religious, fanatics, that kind of thing, that therefore you would also be hardwired for those same things. Right, so in that era, again, since they couldn't really think much more broadly about it, but they felt that if you were had Japanese language, that you were coded to then therefore be this kind of like emperor is the god man that you have to follow blindly, and they threw a bunch of other kind of racist depictions like the kamikaze pilots and things like that. So that all these Japanese people speaking Japanese were all hardwired to do that. Okay, so the government's very much afraid of things in Japanese. What that meant is Japanese artists would often figure out ways to de-language their art. In other words, add more silences in. To teach the silences that they would, but instead of having all this Japanese language and culture to use it, they would figure out ways to teach it without that language or find English translations to kind of like do a transition or buffer. Again, these artists, a lot of these artists all across the board are dealing with their traditions, how to do them without Japanese language, and also to the best of their ability communicate their lineages. Now, in the context of this is running up to the camps, it's very clear that the government cares a lot about language. A lot of the people imprisoned in the first 72 hours after Pearl Harbor, a lot of them were language experts. Again, they're very much concerned with culture and how that codes you into whatever they thought the Japanese emperor worship was, and that kind of thing. So this is very much part of the consciousness of Japanese Americans in the camps as they're doing art, that they can't do Japanese language and must add more silences in to the already existing silences that they have. Now, you're asking, how does that then carry forward? Well, one thing that happens is a lot of times when culture is lost, it doesn't ever come back. Or I should say, when it gets learned in a different way, it doesn't move. Another example, origami. So Japanese people, as in people in Japan, don't do cranes that often, except for the context of death, illness. Why is that? Because after the atomic bombs, the story of Sadako Sasaki, the young girl who passed away from radiation poisoning, part of the legend of it is she wanted to fold 1,000 cranes and to get a wish. And that is actually an ancient tradition, that you do 1,000, which is their Japanese kind of infinity word of prosperity, and they have cranes made for life, so it's kind of like this forever happiness image. It gets translated to a wish, right? So after World War II, after the atomic bombs in Japan, you will never see anything like happy celebration with lots of origami, cranes. Why? Because it means, again, sickness, illness, and death. It's also part of a Japanese national story about the atomic bombs and how they teach young people about that legacy is by making them fold origami cranes, right? So that's happening in Japan. They have a whole legacy of silences and issues with that symbol. The United States, we did not experience the atomic bombs, and so cranes for us actually are our wedding celebration, because it's a traditional Japanese celebration to wish long life and prosperity and forever marriage for the couple by folding cranes for them. We still do that. In fact, I did that for my own wedding, right? So that is definitely still part of our culture. But if you did, I just try to imagine a Japanese person seeing this. like what do you fold? Why are all these cranes here? Did someone die? It's like, no, this is my celebration for our wedding. Okay, why did I point this long story out? The silences of the old Japanese origami stuff is still within Japanese Americans and carries forward, translated within this context of the camps and origami not requiring verbal Japanese cultural knowledge to explain, all carrying forward with all that history attached to it. In Japan's a whole different lineage of those silencing affiliated with those cranes. So what happens? You have a longer history where origami becomes a symbol of community, but then in the camps become one of the only things that can represent them. And then post-camps, one of the only things that represents Japanese culture and happiness, because it's all, again, parts of weddings and families.
So what you're saying then also is that not only did Japanese globally culture change after the war,
right,
which you do talk about in the book, it actually bifurcates into
yes,
uniquely Japanese American culture.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of times what I tell my students is that Japanese Americans sound like old-timey black and white films. Like, because like if we watch like some 1910s, that is a silent film, but really like black and white films, we'd be like, why are they talking that way? Like, people don't talk that way. But back then that was what you expected Hollywood to sound like. Essentially, Japanese Americans sound like that to Japanese people, but it also goes to certain cultural things like origami.
So going back to the question of the context before the camps were set up,
yes,
can you talk about the political environment beyond just the language? What were the things that had to add up to this happening, that it creating a legal precedent and creating a cultural acceptance of that it could happen?
Right. So this is before Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment that was actually built for decades because of anti-Chinese sentiment. So there had been decades of anti-Asian leagues developed against China and Chinese Americans. What they did is actually didn't really reinvent things, but just reapplied all their stereotypes and ideas to the new Japanese immigrants. So there had already been a large apparatus describing Japanese Americans as impossible, the word is inassimilable, unassimilable. In other words, there would be no way to take these people born with Japanese language, hardline to think in their way, to transition to become whatever they thought Americans is. They developed that against Chinese people. So that's one of the reasons they could provide a lot of anti-Chinese laws, is by saying that they could never become American. And in fact, that became a legal term, term of art. It's called aliens ineligible for citizenship. So after the Civil War, all people from Africa were now able to become US citizens. All people from Europe were considered white, and Europe adjacent were also considered white. If you were from Mexico, you were Hispanic, in other words, white. So the only people ineligible for citizenship at that point, after the Civil War, were Asians. So they used this term of art against Chinese people because they didn't want to say, we don't like Chinese people and they don't get certain things. But they would say, if you were not able to be a citizen anyway, why would you say own property? Why could you say get married? Why could you say, do all sorts of things? Oh, pay the same tax rate, because you're not going to be here anyway, so we can tax you at a different rate. A lot of things were applied to that against Chinese people. When Japanese people came over, they just continued that same process. So Japanese people were also ineligible for citizenship, meaning that we also couldn't own property. One weird ramification of this is that Japanese Americans could only lease things because they can't own it. And like farmland or other property, the only places that people were willing to lease us were actually the worst quality property. So we're talking desert land covered in heavy sagebrush. We're talking mountainous regions covered in rocks and mountains and thick forests. We're talking rocky coastline, where if you've ever been to the rocky coastline, it's pretty uninhabitable. Those are the places where Japanese Americans were allowed to lease, and they couldn't own it. They do it, but they were able to turn some of those into moderate success. So abalone, we were one of the best abalone fishermen because we owned those cliff areas. I believe we had a monopoly on asparagus, I think it was, because we translated desert land into productive land. We also had a lot of strawberry fields, also again transitioning desert lands into productive lands. There's a funny guy, I forgot his name, but he's the potato king. He created the grading system, making the AA size and the A size and D size. He created that and made millions off of that. Essentially what this did is allowed Japanese farms to be productive and steady and regular for many years, but they're in this really bad land. What else is in bad land? Military bases. So what are by rocky coastlines? Military bases. What are by open desert lands? Military bases where they do bomb testing and gun exercises and live fire exercises. Mountainous ranges where they set up like helicopters and things like that. And so one of the popular anti-Japanese rhetorics were all these people are setting up shop in order to invade these military bases when Japan should send the signal for them to go destroy them. Okay, so all this to say, the anti-Chinese legislation all built into this interesting intersection where Japanese Americans are all kind of by military bases, not of their own choosing, but because that's the land they're able to lease. And then a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda gets brought up there. So they're worried about Japanese people, Japanese immigrants, doing sabotage. This is again part of the larger culture. Japan went from a third world nation to a first world military in about 50 years. They believe that same process might happen for Japanese Americans, and they're worried that all we're doing is just setting up shop here. So there was fear of our success, and they used some of our moderate farming success as an example of how horrible we are because we can do this sort of thing. Again, it's kind of mind-blowing at the time. So we have all these brought together, leaving a kind of perfect storm where we're a really easy target for political marginalization. Pearl Harbor comes, and then the country's fairly united against Japan, and they're very much against Japanese people being part of the nation. So we were a really easy target to use. Research has shown that politically they didn't really care much about Japanese Americans. We're just kind of a random blip. The public wanted us gone, and so they did kind of just. They didn't really think about it. They're just like, yeah, we just deal with them because we got a war to fight. Like, we don't want to deal with these people. So all that came together to create the internment camps.
Can you explain for viewers what some of the dominant themes are of your life's work in studying all of this professionally? Yeah. And again, its ramifications or echoes today.
So, okay. So today, we're just talking about Japanese Americans. A lot of us, there are very few, in percentage-wise, new Japanese coming over. So most Japanese American communities are in fact people who are inheritors of this long-term historical experience. So that's definitely resonant in the community today. So anyone studying Japanese Americans here are going to be asking about these questions or thinking about these issues. So that's part one. Part two, what is happening today? Well, there's all these apparatuses being set up and precedents being set up by that experience. The legal precedent to remove a large number of people was military necessity. That same doctrine can be used at any point. And in today's terminology, it wouldn't be military necessity, it would be national emergency. So we can use the term national emergency to enact any of those things done on Japanese Americans. There was also the Alien Enemies Act applied to the immediate arrest of people they considered enemy aliens, which are all these cultural experts a lot of times. There was like some martial arts experts, and something like, but very few actual like militaristic people. But again, that apparatus was set up to do mass arrest of specific people, thought to be dangerous saboteurs, or in today's language, terrorists. There's also the precedent of setting up the internment camps themselves. We had a process of, not we as in the U.S. government had a process of doing the immediate removal of people in kind of local communities, the assembly centers, which they adapted all sorts of places for short-term housing, to which then they used that time to build these larger camps, which then they were shipped off to. That whole apparatus of temporary holding places leading to the development of makeshift large prisons, that apparatus is still there today. So all the things set up in that era to deal with Japanese Americans are still active and available for government use today.
Do you see that happening today?
I mean, it's unfortunately on a regular basis being told that this is a positive precedent to do whatever they're trying to do. We're set these assembly centers. We did that before, you know. We set up mass prisons kind of on makeshift, but we did it, you know. We have a legal precedent to remove these people for the following reasons. They're a danger to our country, they're potential saboteurs, and again, today's language, terrorists. So yeah, this is definitely just happening. And again, Japanese American internment being used as a positive example of what we can do and have the legal apparatus to do.
As someone with your expertise and also your culture and background, how does that feel to see that playing out now with a different group of people?
It's being done with several groups of people, and it's infuriating. I often tell my students that if my scholarship is really useful, it's bad. it's a bad day when the things that I've learned about politics, about culture, about imprisonment, about dislocation, relocation, family separation, if those are terms that are immediately make sense and are useful, then we're not in a really good place. In fact, I just want to teach about spirituality and art. I just want to teach my students about how folding origami represents things and can do a good model of education and teaching. Like, I want that. You know, I wanted to do that all the time. But unfortunately, we're in an environment where that knowledge is very useful, very important.
With the art piece, how did you get into the different arts and also your focus originally of African American studies?
Well, again, so art has been part of my life for just about ever. Did a lot of music and continued to do music all through grad school, and so that's always been a part of my life. I did origami, not as a serious way, but just kind of like, you know, as a kid, local community stuff. I do origami for family celebrations and things like that. Let's see, what other things? Oh, I did ukiyo-e, so wood carving and woodblock printing. I did that also as a young adult. So yeah, a lot of Japanese arts have been kind of part of my life, but also again through music, specifically jazz music and free jazz stuff. Those are also multiracial experiences as well. I've been involved in thinking about politics for a long time, so having that as part of art and is not foreign to me and is very much part of it. A formative experience in my youth was the '92 riots, where I learned very quickly that the country is quite divided on the interpretation of very clear things for people. Like that the same video could be interpreted in vastly different ways was a very important formative experience for myself as well. So these ideas of art and politics and communities definitely always been part of my life since as far as I remember, and then it just continues today.
And you're talking about the '92 LA riots, correct?
Yes. I was in California. I was in San Francisco Bay Area, so we're not immediately, affiliated with that. But we're in California. We're very much aware of it. Those sorts of dynamics with race and they're very, very much. We could see that happening in our neighborhoods and communities. So it's not like it was easily translatable for us.
How has it been living in the desert Southwest with one where we had, Arizona, where you live, has its own terrible history with these incarceration camps. Yes. But two, there's not that sense of vibrant Japanese community everywhere you look like you have in San Francisco. Right. How has that affected you?
Oh, well, so I've actually, thanks to academia, moved around a lot. So my first kind of big moment of that was actually in Atlanta, Georgia. So I lived there for a few years. They have Asian Americans there of all kinds, but very few Japanese people. And so I'd go to all sorts of Asian American cultural events or heritage nights or political organizing stuff, and there'd be I'd be the only Japanese person there. So that was actually one of the first kind of moments for me thinking about, my own individual identity in those contexts. I think I lost your question.
Living in a place where you...
Right. So here in the Southwest, I went to undergraduate in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so I'm familiar with the Southwest and kind of racial dynamics. But yeah, going out and not seeing a kind of vibrant Japanese experience everywhere definitely is a thing for me. Growing up, I would go to San Francisco fairly often, at least monthly, if not more. So being connected to all these Japanese American things and Japanese culture and Japanese events and stuff, I can't provide that for my kids in that same way. So yeah, I think there's going to be, looking forward and thinking about my children, I definitely have that thought. But as a Japanese American, providing my own experience personally and academically in this place, I think of it, in many ways that's kind of why I'm here. I can provide that information. But also, yeah, it can be tough that no one has that same experience. On the other hand, I'm able to empathize with a lot of current events here, so I think that's very helpful.
In your book, you talk about the racist trope of the model minority and about how that kind of developed after the war, and yes. I think you used the term the neutering or the masculinization of the Japanese people after being bombed and everything, yeah. And how that all kind of came together.
Yes.
And the model minority idea. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that affects specifically Japanese Americans, but then also in a broader context?
So one of the issues there, I guess about the 80s, the results of the civil rights era actually started to bear fruit for Japanese Americans. So a lot of us, not a lot, a good number of us have been educated, or at least have access to education even from before the war. What happened after the 50s and 60s, Japanese Americans could actually go to college, and then could actually, if they went to college, have the degree honored and go into those fields. So by the 1980s, a lot of that, those decades of built up resources had been actually coming to fruition. One of the issues with that is we often became a symbol of a model minority. That we had literally gone from nothing having all of our properties, well, we didn't even own things, but our quote unquote property removed from us during the war. And then a few decades later, now going to college, getting degrees, showing up, being lawyers and doctors and all sorts of things like that. We often became synonymous with the kind of model minority, right? This is a problem because, again, we're living this experience, and my grandparents' generation going like, yeah, it's great, don't complain, don't worry about it. It's just like it's all good for you now. Whereas in emotional need and in our actual history and our self-knowledge, these are things that the longer legacy we've been talking about today. It's all encoded in us, and we do need to know about it because it's just in the back of our minds a lot.
We were talking earlier about how people here didn't even know about the incarceration or the camps, even though there's a prison, a very famous one right here, and just a couple of hours away, a really brutal one.
Right.
Do you feel like this is kind of your legacy to bring awareness to this and say, hey, we've been here before?
Yeah. So one of the things I've tried to think through, and I try to think through the longer history being involved. One of the reasons that these internment camps got to be set up in these places was because of the mass destruction of Native Americans. And so even having the camp called Gila River is maddening. So I often try to think through when I'm teaching about these sorts of things, not only just like, oh, Japanese Americans have a place here, look at Gila, but to go like, the reason Gila exists as a camp is because of the reservation system and everything that went with it. So I try to make those connections across. So being here is helpful because it's not just my own story or my own family story, but also linking it across these longer stories of the Southwest. So I definitely see that as a kind of mission to link these things together.
And do you think right now, under the political climate and current conditions, do you feel like your work is being hampered in any way, or that you have to be more careful about certain things, whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, so I can share a little bit. Yeah, it's definitely, we live in an era currently, as we record here, where what you say could be more detrimental to your career than any other thing at any point, right? So self-censorship is a real thing today. I have my classrooms were recorded. Students could, if they wanted to, record things, even though that's technically not allowed, but they could record things. A career could be ended at any moment. I personally don't have I'm not in what's called a tenure track position, meaning that I don't have any kind of further academic protections. I'm a year-to-year contract, so my job could be terminated at any moment, right? So I know these things. My utility and usefulness is hampered because I can't do the full things that I would like to or are important to do. So yeah, I can share those things. A lot of self-censoring, a lot of messages given by all sorts of levels of my existence, saying that it's dangerous right now. So that's all possible. I do know from the legacy of the internment camps that people with citizenship could have that removed pretty easily and quickly. So though technically I am a U.S. citizen, I can see that being removed quite fast. A lot of the legacy of the internment camps was people with citizenship not only having it not honored, but essentially having other legal loopholes to remove it, or at least not having it valid. So, thinking about my grandparents all being enemy aliens at one point, technically are not really U.S. citizens. I mean, they are, but are quasi-citizen. So knowing that, I could see my citizenship being retroactively revoked without too much of a headache. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot of concern, thinking about my kids, thinking about my family. And again, knowing that legacy, it's not like, it's not reassuring at all. In fact, I know all the things that can happen, so.
Do you think that influenced your ability to see things in a non-binary fashion or a more nuanced fashion?
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Yes, absolutely. So knowing that anything can be taken away, judgments can switch. I grew up in the 80s, and there was a lot of anti-Japanese rhetoric at the time, mostly to do with the automobile industry. And so I grew up with that very consciously, that to be Japanese didn't necessarily mean all the good things it is today with like popular culture and stuff. So all that's very much part of my growing up, and I've never had the false thought that I'm just a U.S. citizen. No one can touch it and that kind of thing. No, it's definitely not a property of myself. It's just it's a fortunate status, I should say.
Wow. Well, we're about out of time. So thank you so much again for sharing your story and your expertise with us. And I'd like to ask if there are 2 questions. If there's anything that I didn't ask that you would like to address, and also, is there any kind of advice or wisdom that you'd like to share with people concerning this?
Oh, so just a quick thing. My last chapter is actually on monuments. And there are Japanese Americans who have actively built monuments to this experience. Try to artistically illustrate it, try to didactically, in other words, just tell the story to illustrate things, sometimes in the same art piece. The reason I want to end with this, or at least mention this, it's important to us, part 1, but in addition to what we're doing in these spaces is not just make a political statement. A lot of these monuments are expressing that we have a spirit and we want to move forward and we want to keep active and lively and be have our full humanity. They're more declarations as opposed to assertions. More like we want this to happen. Not necessarily saying that we're living it at the moment, but thinking of the linkage of art, spirituality, and silence. I think there's a lot of these monuments that have tried to move this forward and teach the next generations all these complex histories and stories.
Thank you so much, and this concludes the interview. This is the end of the interview.